Let them keep their nightmare. We will not inherit it.
Earth Campaign Archive complete. Labeling: the species in the Do Not Replicate Vault. Again, maybe this time they'll tire. They have to.
They came for a dying species. They left running from a nightmare they never saw coming. The Veil, the most feared military force in 7 star systems, did not expect resistance. They expected surrender. They expected collapse. What they got instead was something their war doctrine had no word for: a soldier who would not stop, could not stop. A human being who had chemically erased the concept of rest from his own body. And now, there were thousands more just like him. If you are watching this for the first time, hit that like button, subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, and drop a comment telling us, would you take the injection? Because after what you are about to witness, that question is going to hit very differently. Now strap in. This journey into the darkest corner of human survival starts right now. The first Veil warship entered Earth's orbit on a Tuesday morning. No declaration, no warning broadcast, no diplomatic signal, just a shadow the size of a city falling across the Pacific Ocean, and then 17 more behind it. Commander Dale Hargrove was standing in the Joint Strategic Operations Center, buried 400 feet beneath Colorado, when the first satellite feeds went dark. He was 43 years old, built like a man who had never stopped doing push-ups since the age of 19, and in that moment, looking at a wall of screens going black, one by one, he felt something he had not felt since his first deployment in hostile territory. He felt genuinely afraid. "Talk to me," he said. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had trained himself to keep fear exactly 1 centimeter behind his eyes and no further. Analyst Marcus Webb, 28 years old and 3 weeks out from a doctoral program he had abandoned when the alien signal first reached Earth's detection arrays, turned from his terminal. 18 vessels, sir. Triangular formation. The lead craft is approximately 11 kilometers bow to stern. The others are smaller. We are estimating escort-class configurations based on the energy signatures. Weapons? Everything we have got is a weapon, sir. Every surface on those ships is radiating on frequencies we have never cataloged before. Our best guess is that they have not even powered up their primary systems yet. Dale stared at the central display. The shadow over the Pacific was moving. Slowly, patiently, like a predator that had already decided the hunt was over before it began. Not with Earth's governments. Not with its military command structures. They transmitted a single image, broadcast simultaneously across every frequency human technology could receive. It was a visual catalog. Hundreds of species, some humanoid, some completely alien in form, all of them shown in 2 states, before and after. Cities, then ruins, populations, then silence. It was not a threat, it was a menu, and humanity was the next item on it. What followed in the next 72 hours is a matter of historical record now, though most of the details were classified for years afterward. Earth's combined military response was immediate, coordinated, and almost completely ineffective. Conventional ballistic weapons were absorbed by hull plating that seemed to redistribute kinetic impact across its entire surface. Directed energy platforms caused brief surface heating that the Veil ships neutralized within seconds. One orbital strike package managed to scratch the paint on an escort vessel. That was the high point. The Veil landed ground forces on 4 continents simultaneously. Not to destroy, to demonstrate. Each insertion team was small, between 12 and 20 individuals, and each one moved through whatever military response it encountered, like water moving through sand. The Veil were approximately 2.5 meters tall on average. Their bodies structured around a physiology that combined extraordinary short burst speed with crushing physical strength. Their armor was smart reactive, reading incoming threats and hardening in the precise location of impact before the impact arrived. Their weapons did not kill cleanly. They incapacitated, and then they waited, and then they withdrew. They left the survivors on purpose. The message was intentional. We are choosing to give you time to understand that. Colonel Sandra Pierce, commander of the 4th Rapid Response Brigade, filed a report after the London demonstration that became the foundation of everything that came after. She wrote, "The enemy does not fight in sustained engagements. They strike at maximum intensity for periods ranging from 8 to 20 minutes, then withdraw completely. Our attempts to pursue were unsuccessful. Satellite tracking indicates that withdrawal teams enter a recovery phase lasting between 4 and 7 hours before they are combat effective again. This is not a tactical choice. This appears to be a biological necessity." She underlined that last sentence 3 times. Dale Hargrove read that report at 2 in the morning in a situation room that smelled like cold coffee and controlled panic. Then, he pulled up a name he had been given 6 months earlier by a DARPA program director who had described the research with the words, "We funded it, we shut it down, and we hope to God nobody ever tries to actually use it." The name was Dr. Raymond Ackerman. The file attached to that name was stamped with enough classification layers that Dale had to use 3 separate authorization codes to open it. When he finally got through, he sat very still for a long time. Then, he picked up the phone. The call that went out to Dr. Raymond Ackerman at 2:47 a.m. on a Wednesday was the kind of call that changes everything. And somewhere in a research facility that officially did not exist, a 51-year-old scientist with tired eyes and a decade of guilt on his shoulders picked up the receiver and said, very quietly, "I was wondering when someone was finally going to make this call." The world had no idea what Dale Hargrove had just set in motion. But the Veil were about to find out. The facility was in Nevada. Not the famous one that conspiracy theorists had been arguing about for decades. A different one, deeper, newer, and built specifically to house research that the public was never meant to know existed. Dale arrived by helicopter at 0400 hours with a security detail and a briefing folder he had already read 4 times on the flight. Dr. Raymond Ackerman met him on the landing pad. The scientist was thin in the way that people who forget to eat become thin. Not from discipline, but from obsession. He had gray at his temples, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the look of a man who had been awake for at least 30 hours before Dale's chopper even touched down. "Commander Hargrove," Ackerman said. He did not extend his hand. "You read the full file? Everything in it. Then you know why it was shut down. What it does, what it was designed to do, was treat a very specific class of terminal neurological condition where the brain's fatigue regulation systems had been catastrophically damaged. Patients in that condition die slowly. Their bodies cannot maintain basic homeostatic regulation without the continuous chemical signaling that fatigue normally provides." He paused. "We engineered something that replaced that signaling entirely, artificially, permanently. It removes the need for sleep." "No." Ackerman looked at him steadily. "That is the simplified version, and it is dangerously incomplete. Sleep is just one function of fatigue regulation. What Compound Rho does is replace the entire fatigue cycle with a synthetic chemical loop. The body still produces lactic acid. Muscles still generate the cellular byproducts of exertion. But instead of those compounds triggering the shutdown cascade that leads to exhaustion, they are intercepted at the bone marrow level, the injection site, and converted. Recycled. The fatigue chemistry becomes fuel. The body runs on what would otherwise be the signal to stop." Dale stared at the bag. "So the subject never gets tired." "The subject never gets tired, never experiences muscular fatigue in the conventional sense, never requires sleep. The brain remains in a state of continuous high-focus operation without the degradation that normally accompanies sleep deprivation." Ackerman's voice had gone very flat, clinical, the voice of a man describing something he had thought about so many times that the emotion had been worn smooth. "It also substantially increases the production of synthetic adrenaline analogs in response to perceived threat, meaning that a subject in combat conditions operates at a sustained physical and cognitive output that would be neurologically impossible for an unmodified human. Why did you shut it down?" The scientist was quiet for a moment. He walked to the far wall where a filing cabinet stood and pulled out a folder. He placed it on the workbench in front of Dale without opening it. "Because it does not turn off," he said. The modification is permanent. The chemical loop, once established, cannot be interrupted without catastrophic neurological failure. We had one human trial, one volunteer, a terminal patient who had 6 weeks to live and consented fully to the procedure. He survived. He was fully functional. His physical metrics were extraordinary. Another pause. He could not sleep, not ever, not for any reason, for the rest of his life. We monitored him for 14 months before the project was terminated. He was alive. He was cognitively intact. But the absence of sleep, even when the body does not biologically require it, has a cost that we did not anticipate. What cost? Ackerman finally looked up from the folder. The human mind was not built to be permanently on. Even if the body can sustain it, there are psychological processes that require the unconscious state to resolve. The architecture of the mind has a maintenance cycle, Commander. Dreams are not decorative. Without that maintenance, the mind begins to reorganize itself in ways that are functional, even advantageous in some contexts, but not recognizably normal. How not normal? Our subject described his internal experience as, and I am quoting from his own words here, like being inside a machine that has forgotten it was ever anything else. That was perhaps the most unsettling finding. He was not distressed. He was simply relentless. In every aspect of his existence, he did not stop pursuing anything. Work, thought, physical activity. The concept of enough ceased to have meaning for him. The room was very quiet. Dale picked up the folder from the workbench. He opened it. He looked at the photograph inside. A man in his 40s, lean and clear-eyed and utterly calm, standing in a monitoring room, with a dozen sensor leads attached to his chest. The man's eyes were what stayed with Dale. Not frightening, not empty, just unblinking, focused. The eyes of something that had fully committed to the act of existing and had stopped questioning it. "How many doses can you produce?" Dale asked. Ackerman closed his eyes briefly. "With the facility fully operational and the supply chain restored, we would need approximately 11 days to produce enough for a battalion-scale deployment. You have 9. The scientist did not argue. He simply nodded, slowly, and walked toward the covered equipment. He began pulling the dust cloths off, one by one. Outside, somewhere above the Nevada desert, the Vale's orbital assets were running their patient, methodical scans. They had given humanity their demonstration. They were now waiting for the surrender that their war doctrine told them would arrive within 72 hours. They were very experienced at this. They had never been wrong before. They did not know that 9 floors beneath a desert they considered already conquered, a man with unblinking eyes and an old photograph had just given his species an idea that was going to change the shape of war forever. The call for volunteers went out through channels that did not officially exist, to soldiers whose personnel files listed them as assigned to units that did not appear on any public organizational chart. The criteria were specific. Combat veterans, Tier 1 operators or equivalent. No dependents. Full psychological evaluation completed within the last 90 days. And one final criterion that had never appeared in any military recruitment document in the history of the United States Armed Forces. Willingness to undergo a permanent, irreversible biological modification with no guarantee of survival, and no possibility of reversal. 43 men stepped forward in the first 24 hours. Commander Dale Hargrove read each of their files personally. He sat in the situation room with those 43 folders spread across the conference table and tried to find a reason to stop what he was about to set in motion. He could not find one. Because in the same 24-hour period, the Vale had conducted 2 additional demonstration strikes, one in Sao Paulo, one in Seoul, and the casualty counts were climbing toward numbers that made his chest feel like concrete. The first 10 volunteers were brought to the Nevada facility at 0300 hours on the 4th day after Dale's initial conversation with Dr. Ackerman. Sergeant First Class Travis Cole was among them. Travis was 31 years old, 6 feet 2, 210 pounds of controlled aggression shaped by 12 years of service that had taken him from Ranger Battalion to a selection process so classified that his official record simply showed a gap where those years should have been. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, eyes the color of old iron, and the kind of absolute stillness in his bearing that comes from having been in enough situations where moving wrong gets people killed. He sat in the briefing room while Ackerman explained the procedure in the same flat clinical voice he had used with Dale. Travis listened without interrupting. When Ackerman finished, Travis asked one question. After the injection, can I still perform at combat effectiveness? Ackerman looked at him steadily. Yes, more than that. Then I'm in. The injection process was not simple. Compound Rho could not be administered intravenously in the conventional sense. The compound had to be delivered directly into the bone marrow, specifically the sternum, the femur shafts, and the posterior iliac crests, using a pressurized delivery system that forced the compound through the cortical bone and into the marrow cavity, where it could establish its chemical foothold in the body's primary blood cell production system. In plain language, it was one of the most painful medical procedures that had ever been deliberately performed on a conscious human being. Travis went first. He sat in the modified medical chair with his hands on the armrests and his jaw set, and he did not make a sound for the 47 minutes the procedure required. His vital signs spiked to extremes that made the monitoring technicians visibly uncomfortable. His grip on the armrests left impressions in the material. When it was over, he sat very still for a long moment. Then he looked up at Ackerman, who was watching him from behind a glass panel. I can feel it, Travis said. His voice was different. Not louder, not changed in any obvious way. But there was a quality to it that had not been there before, like a frequency that had been added to a signal. It's like everything got clearer. Everything that was background noise just dropped out. Over the next 6 hours, the other 9 volunteers went through the procedure. 2 of them did not survive the process. Their systems could not establish the chemical loop properly, and they went into catastrophic cardiac failure. 8 survived. 8 men who walked out of that facility changed in ways that no physical examination would fully capture for months. The monitoring period that Ackerman had originally planned for was compressed by necessity from 14 days to 72 hours. What they observed in that period was both extraordinary and deeply unsettling. The subjects did not sleep. They did not attempt to sleep. When the observation period's nighttime hours arrived, they remained fully awake, fully alert, and in most cases engaged in some form of physical or cognitive activity. Not because they were anxious, not because they were afraid, because the concept of stopping had simply ceased to be relevant to how they processed the world. Their physical performance metrics were beyond anything previously recorded for human subjects. Travis ran a treadmill stress test that the machine's maximum setting could not challenge. When the equipment hit its limit, he stepped off and asked if there was anything heavier to lift. The training staff looked at each other, and then at the man standing before them. Not sweating, barely breathing harder than normal, with those iron-colored eyes focused forward like a targeting system that had locked on and was waiting for permission to engage. On the psychological assessment side, the findings were consistent with what Ackerman's original trial had shown. The subjects were not distressed, they were not confused, they were cognitively intact, responsive, and fully capable of following complex orders and executing nuanced tactical decisions. But something in the texture of how they engaged with the world had shifted. Fear responses were not absent, they were present, but had been rewired. Fear was no longer a brake, it had become an accelerant. Dale observed the training exercises on the 3rd day. He stood at the edge of a combat simulation course and watched Travis and the other 7 move through a scenario designed for a 12-man team. They moved differently than normal soldiers. Not faster exactly, more continuous. Other soldiers have a rhythm. Move, pause, assess, move again. The Veil had that rhythm too, which was precisely why they were so effective. They could read the pauses. They could predict the assessment windows. Travis and his team had eliminated the pauses entirely. They moved like water, constant and smooth, never stopping, never creating the recovery gaps that an opponent could read and exploit. Dale watched this for 20 minutes. Then he turned to Ackerman, who was standing beside him. "They're ready," Dale said. Ackerman looked out at the exercise field, where 8 men who would never sleep again were practicing the art of never stopping. "Commander," he said quietly, "I want to be certain you understand what you are committing to. This is not a temporary solution. These men will never be what they were before. If we expand the program, we need 400, Dale said. Minimum. The scientist was quiet for a long time. The sounds of the training exercise carried across the desert air. Footsteps that never broke rhythm. The sound of absolute, relentless forward motion. Then we need more time, Ackerman finally said. We don't have more time. Dale picked up his radio. We have a war to take back. But taking the war back meant finding out exactly how the Veil fought, and exactly where their biological necessity for rest would create the opening humanity needed. What none of them knew yet was that the Veil had already noticed something unusual about the humans they had faced in their last demonstration. Something that was making their tactical commanders run calculations that were coming back with answers they did not like. The hunters were about to discover that the prey had stopped behaving like prey. And that realization, slow and confused at first, then building towards something close to alarm, was the beginning of the end of everything the Veil thought they knew about this war. The Veil's ground commander was named Tessavar Prime, a designation that translated roughly as First Blade of the Chosen. He had conducted 43 planetary pacification operations over a career spanning what humans would calculate as 60 years. He had never lost one. He stood in the command bay of the lead warship and reviewed the anomaly reports from his reconnaissance assets with an expression that his subordinates could not read. Among the Veil, unreadable expressions on a superior officer were rare and never welcome. The anomaly was simple. In the 43 hours since the last demonstration strikes, the human military's communication patterns had not followed the expected model. There had been no increase in surrender-adjacent signals. No diplomatic outreach, no requests for communication, no broadcasts that matched the profile of a species beginning to accept the inevitability of capitulation. Instead, there had been a sharp decrease in detectable military communication across all frequencies, as though a significant portion of the human force had simply gone quiet. In Tessavar Prime's experience, there were 2 reasons a military force went quiet. One was because it had collapsed. The other was because it was preparing something it did not want observed. He ordered a 3rd demonstration strike, smaller this time, surgical, a targeted insertion at a military installation in the American interior with the specific purpose of drawing out whatever response the humans were preparing, so it could be assessed and countered before it became a factor. The insertion team that dropped onto Ellsworth Air Force Base at 012-12 hours was 12 Veil soldiers at peak conditioning. They had completed a full regenerative cycle 4 hours prior. Their combat systems were at 100%. By every metric Tessavar Prime's doctrine recognized, they were as combat effective as it was possible to be. They encountered resistance within 40 seconds of landing. The resistance came from 8 figures who moved in a way that the Veil assault team's combat assessment systems initially flagged as a sensor error. The data being returned by the motion tracking arrays simply did not match any biological movement profile the Veil had ever cataloged. The figures were moving continuously, not with the burst and pause pattern that characterized every biological combatant the Veil had ever faced, including the fastest species in their war records, but in an unbroken, flowing, self-sustaining motion that seemed to ignore the normal rhythms of exertion. The Veil team leader transmitted a status report back to the warship. Contact. 8 human units. Behavior anomalous. Engaging. That was the last transmission the assault team sent. Travis Cole hit the lead Veil soldier at a dead run from a position the alien sensors had assessed as occupied 40 seconds prior and empty ever since. The assessment was wrong, because Travis had not stopped moving in those 40 seconds. He had moved completely around the alien's position in a wide arc, never pausing, never giving the sensor a stationary target to reclassify as a threat. The impact drove the Veil soldier backward into its second-in-command. Travis did not stop to assess the result. He was already moving to the next target, his team spreading through the insertion zone in a pattern that had no recovery gaps, no windows, no moments where any of them were standing still long enough to be correctly processed by the alien threat assessment systems that had been calibrated for combatants who, like every other species the Veil had ever fought, needed to occasionally stop. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, 3 Veil soldiers were in custody, and 9 had been incapacitated. Travis stood in the center of the landing zone afterward. His breathing steady and controlled, his eyes moving across the perimeter in the continuous, methodical scan that had replaced what used to be the quiet moment after a fight. He no longer had quiet moments. There was no switch that brought him down from the operational state. He was simply always there, in the zone, focused, moving, or ready to move. The captured Veil soldiers were processed and transported within the hour. Their physical condition, once examined, told a story that confirmed what Colonel Pierce's original report had identified. The Veil were extraordinary fighters. Their physiology during the active combat phase was genuinely superior to baseline human capability in almost every measurable category. But they had been in a sustained engagement for 11 minutes, and the cellular markers in their tissue samples told the story clearly. The biological necessity of recovery was asserting itself with a force that their superior physical conditioning could not indefinitely resist. Dale reviewed the footage of the engagement in the Situation Room at 0400 hours. He watched it 3 times. Then he made the call he had been calculating since the night he first read Ackerman's file. We expand the program. All 43 volunteers, as fast as Ackerman can process them. General Frank Whitmore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was on the call. He was 70 years old, and had been a soldier for 50 of them, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man watching something he was not certain the country would survive knowing about. Dale, he said carefully. What we are doing to these men. What we are doing to these men, Dale said, is the only reason any of us are going to be alive in 60 days. Sir. The silence on the line lasted 4 seconds. Authorized, Whitmore said. God help us all. In the Veil warship above the Pacific, Tessavar Prime received the news of his insertion team's defeat, and experienced something genuinely novel in 60 years of command. He experienced uncertainty. Not alarm. He was too experienced for alarm at a single anomalous result, but uncertainty. Because the data from his team's combat assessment systems, reviewed in full, showed something his doctrine had no category for. The humans had not fought well. They had fought continuously. There was a difference, and it was a difference that mattered enormously to a military philosophy built on the exploitation of recovery gaps. If there were no recovery gaps, then the entire strategic architecture of Veil warfare was fighting an enemy it had never been designed to face. Tessavar Prime ordered a full tactical review. He gave his analysts 12 hours. He did not know that in 12 hours, 31 more humans would emerge from a facility in Nevada with their sleep permanently erased and their bodies running on the chemical alchemy of their own exhaustion. He did not know that the next time his forces landed on Earth's surface, they would not find prey waiting to be demonstrated into submission. They would find something that would follow them back to their ships if it could find a way. The Veil's 4th ground operation was not a demonstration. It was a full tactical deployment. 200 soldiers across 6 simultaneous insertion points, coordinated with orbital fire support, designed to systematically destroy Earth's military command and control infrastructure and force the capitulation that should, by every principle Tessavar Prime understood, have arrived long ago. It was also the moment the war changed permanently. The insertion points had been selected based on intelligence gathered from the previous 3 operations, the locations of communication arrays, command bunkers, logistics hubs. The Veil's targeting data was accurate. What their intelligence had not captured, because it had happened in facilities that did not officially exist, was that 39 additional human soldiers had undergone the Marrow Protocol in the preceding 72 hours, and those soldiers had been distributed to exactly the facilities that Tessavar Prime's insertion teams were now targeting. Travis Cole was at the Colorado Command Bunker. He had been awake for 91 continuous hours. His body showed no sign of it. His mind, if the word mind still fully applied to what his cognitive architecture had become, was clearer and sharper than it had ever been before the injection. He stood in the operations center with 5 other protocol soldiers and listened to the Veil insertion teams approach on the sensor arrays. 47 Veil soldiers, coming down in 3 landing craft. Estimated time to breach, 6 minutes. Travis looked at his 5-person team. None of them had eaten in the last 12 hours, because the body's demand for fuel had been substantially altered by the protocol. They needed less of everything except purpose, and purpose was something none of them were running short on. "We go out to meet them," Travis said. The operations staff around them exchanged looks. Meeting a 47-person Veil assault force in the open with 6 soldiers was not the doctrine. Doctrine called for defended positions, choke points, overlapping fields of fire. Travis was not thinking in doctrine anymore. He was thinking in a language that had no name yet, the language of something that doesn't stop. "They need us to be where they expect us to be," he said. "Fixed, defending, waiting. That's how they read the engagement. That's how they calculate the recovery gaps." He picked up his weapon and moved toward the door. "So we won't be there." What happened outside the Colorado bunker in the next 22 minutes was documented from 17 different sensor angles and reviewed by military analysts for years afterward. The footage was never released to the public, but the classified reports that described it used language that was notably different from the language of standard after-action reports. Words appeared in those reports that did not normally appear in military documentation. Words like relentless, inexorable, and in one report filed by a Veil combat assessment AI that was later captured and analyzed, a phrase that translated approximately as, "They do not have an end state." The Veil soldiers who landed at the Colorado site were elite. They fought well and hard. But they fought in the rhythm that 3 generations of successful warfare had embedded in their biology and their doctrine. Intense engagement, then the subtle but real degradation that comes after the first 15 minutes of maximum output. The point where the body's chemistry begins shifting toward recovery mode, whether the tactical situation allows for it or not. Travis and his team were not on that rhythm. They were not on any rhythm. They were constant, like a river, moving and present and impossible to fully account for, because they were never in the same place twice, and never paused long enough to be isolated. When the Veil assault team's leader made the tactical decision to withdraw and regroup after 22 minutes of engagement that had produced no decisive result, Travis did not stop. He followed. The Veil soldiers, moving toward their landing craft at the disciplined pace their doctrine prescribed for tactical withdrawal, discovered that the humans they were withdrawing from were keeping up. More than keeping up. Not uniform. At 2 sites the Veil achieved their primary objectives before being engaged by protocol forces, and the damage to those command structures was real. But the strategic calculation had flipped. The Veil's doctrine operated on the principle that after a successful strike, the force would withdraw, recover, and return. At site after site, the withdrawal triggered pursuit. Not the kind of pursuit that spent itself in the first 5 minutes and fell back. Pursuit that did not stop. Tessevar Prime received the reports over the span of 3 hours, each one building on the last. He sat in the command bay of the warship and processed what he was being told with the careful, disciplined analysis that had made him the most successful ground commander in the Veil military's history. When he finished processing, he did something he had not done since his 3rd operation, 38 years ago. He called for a full command review. His generals assembled in the command bay. They were experienced. They were confident. They were, for the first time in any of their collective memory, facing a tactical problem that their entire military philosophy had not been built to address. "The humans have eliminated their recovery phase," Tessevar Prime said. The statement was flat, factual. The room was very quiet. "Our doctrine is predicated on exploitation of recovery phases. Every species we have encountered shares this biological baseline. Rest is not optional for any organism with a complex nervous system, or so our science has always held." He looked at the reports on the display. "We weren't wrong." One of his generals spoke. "We have orbital assets we can sterilize." "If we sterilize from orbit," Tessevar Prime said slowly, we have lost. We came here to add this world's resources to our civilization. A sterilized world has no resources. We cannot achieve our objective with orbital bombardment. He paused. And there is another consideration. The room waited. If they have done this to themselves, if they have found a way to eliminate the biological limits that every military philosophy in this galaxy has always assumed were universal, then the question is no longer whether we can pacify Earth. Tessevar Prime's voice was controlled, but something beneath it had shifted. Something old and certain had come loose. The question is whether we can contain what they have discovered before it spreads. Because if other species, if anyone else, learns what humanity has done to itself, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The room understood. And for the first time in 60 years of command, Tessevar Prime did not have an answer. In the Nevada facility, Ackerman stood alone in the laboratory, where it had all started, looking at the remaining supply of Compound Rho. There was enough left for another 40 doses. He was thinking about what he had made, about what it meant for the species that had made it, about whether winning a war was the same thing as surviving one. He did not have answers either. But outside, across the desert and the country and the planet, something that had started in his laboratory was now loose in the world, and it was not going to stop. The Veil fleet departed Earth's orbit 11 months after its arrival. It was not a defeat in any conventional military sense. No decisive battle had broken them. No single engagement had forced their hand. What had broken them was something more gradual and more total than a battle. It was the realization, built over months of engagement with an enemy that did not rest, that the strategic calculation had been wrong from the beginning. Not tactically wrong, philosophically wrong. Every military doctrine the Veil had ever developed rested on a single assumption so fundamental that it had never needed to be written down. All combatants have limits. All combatants reach the point where biology demands rest. All combatants eventually stop. Humanity had stopped stopping. The political decision to withdraw was made by the Veil High Conclave after a classified review that years later was partially reconstructed by human intelligence assets. The review's conclusion, translated from the Veil's primary communication form, said approximately, "The cost-benefit analysis for the pacification of this system has become negative and is continuing to deteriorate. The primary driver of this deterioration is the human modification program. Secondary concern, if this modification technology is disseminated beyond the originating species, the strategic calculus for every operation in our active theater becomes uncertain. Recommend withdrawal and containment posture." Tessevar Prime returned to Veil space, having never lost a battle on Earth's surface. He had simply failed to win the war. In his post-campaign review, he wrote something that became, in subsequent years, the most quoted text in Veil military history, studied and debated in their academies for generations. "We did not understand what we were fighting. We thought we were fighting a species. We were fighting an idea. And ideas do not have recovery phases." On Earth, the aftermath was complicated. 41 protocol soldiers had survived the war. 2 had been killed in action, not by Veil weapons, but by the secondary effects of the biological toll that even Compound Rho's chemical loop could not entirely eliminate. The human body was remarkable in its adaptability, but it was not infinitely tolerant of being run as a machine indefinitely. And 2 men had died when systems that the protocol had not been designed to support finally failed. 39 men who would never sleep again. Commander Dale Hargrove sat across a table from Travis Cole in a conference room at the Pentagon, 6 weeks after the Veil fleet's last ship vanished from orbital detection range. It was the first time he had spoken to Travis at length since the early days of the program, and the difference between the man who had volunteered and the man sitting across from him now was something that Dale had no comfortable way to classify. Travis looked healthy. He looked alert. He looked, in every observable way, like a man in excellent physical condition, with full cognitive function and no apparent distress. His eyes were the same iron color they had always been. But the way they moved, the continuous, patient, methodical scan of the room that never fully settled, never fully stopped looking for the next thing, was something that no amount of familiarity had made Dale comfortable with. "How are you?" Dale asked. Travis considered the question with the thoroughness he applied to everything now. Good, he said. Clear. A pause. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. There's no reference point for normal anymore. There's just this, continuous. Another pause. I don't miss sleep. I thought I would. I don't. Do you miss anything about before? Travis looked at him steadily. I miss the moments after a fight, when you could just sit down and let it be over for a while. The quiet when everything stops. He looked away for a moment, out the window. There's no after for me now. It's all during. Every minute is during. Dale nodded. He did not know what to say to that. The government program that attempted to systematically study the long-term effects of Compound Rho occupied several research institutions for years and produced conclusions that were carefully managed in terms of public release. The protocol soldiers were not prisoners. They had full legal status, full rights, and the ability to live and work as they chose, within the security constraints that their knowledge of classified information necessarily imposed. Most of them remained in service, not because they were required to, because stopping was no longer in their vocabulary. Dr. Raymond Ackerman submitted his resignation from the program the week the Vale fleet departed. He wrote a letter that Dale kept in his desk drawer and read occasionally in the years that followed. The letter said in part, I do not regret what we did. I want to be certain of that, because I think the temptation to perform that kind of regret will be significant in the coming years, and I want to have stated the truth while I still have full confidence in it. What we did was necessary. What we did may have saved our species. But I have also spent considerable time thinking about what Tessavar Prime was most afraid of. Not that we had done this to ourselves, but that the idea would spread. That other species would learn from us, and I find myself not entirely certain that his fear was wrong. The letter ended, humanity has always been most dangerous when it is most desperate. What we have done now is make desperation permanent. I am not certain the universe is prepared for what that means. I suspect it will find out. HFY Endurance Tales has covered many stories of human endurance, ingenuity, and the terrifying costs of survival. This one sits differently. Not because the humans won, but because of what they became in order to win, and what it means for every civilization watching from the darkness of the galaxy that humanity is not going to stop. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment and tell us, would you have volunteered? And share this with someone who thinks humanity's limits are fixed. They need to know that we already broke them. Because the universe learned something the day the Veil retreated from Earth. It learned that the most frightening thing in the galaxy is not the species with the biggest ships, or the sharpest weapons, or the most advanced technology. It is the species that decided it was done sleeping. Subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales for more stories of humanity's terrifying edge. Share this video. The galaxy is watching, and so should they.